The sky had turned the color of rust by the time Silas Bridger finished chopping wood behind the barn. Summer in the Colorado Territory came hard that year with heat that pressed down like a wool blanket and dust that rose with every footfall. The day had stretched, long, dry, and relentless, the kind that wore through a man's patience and left his muscles aching by dusk. Silas stood with the splitting maul still gripped in both hands, back stiff from hours of work, eyes scanning the horizon out of pure habit. Not looking for anyone in particular, just looking. After 20 years as a cavalry scout, a man learned to read the land to feel when something sat wrong with the world. And right now, something did. The air held too still. No breeze moved through the scrub grass. The cottonwoods along the dry creek beds stood motionless, their leaves hanging limp in the heat. Even the birds had gone quiet, and that never meant anything good. He set the maul against the chopping block and wiped his forearm across his brow. Sweat stung his eyes. The scars under his shirt pulled tight when he moved old wounds from old fights, the kind that ached when weather changed or when he worked too long without rest. His right knee, the bad one, throbbed with each step. A horse had rolled on it during a river crossing back in '64, and it hadn't been right since. The ranch sat tucked between two mesas that rose like cathedral walls on either side of the narrow valley. He'd chosen this spot deliberately 3 years back. Remote, defensible, far enough from the main trails that most travelers never knew it existed. Close enough to a spring that water wouldn't be a problem, even in drought years like this one. He'd built the cabin with his own hands. Logged the timber from the high country, hauled it down on a sledge, pulled by the black stallion that now stood in the corral watching him with dark, knowing eyes. Peeled every log, notched every joint, chinked every gap with a mixture of mud and grass that dried hard as stone. The roof was cedar shake tight enough to shed rain, but rough enough that snow would catch and insulate come winter. Inside, everything had its place. Tools hung on pegs driven into the log walls arranged by size and function. Rope coiled neat on a shelf. Leather harness oiled and supple. Jars of dried beans and cornmeal lined the pantry. A cast iron stove squatted in one corner, its chimney rising straight through the roof. The bed occupied the opposite corner, a simple frame with a corn husk mattress and wool blankets folded at the foot. On a shelf above the bed sat a child's toy, a horse carved from pine, no bigger than a man's hand. Beside it rested a silver-backed hairbrush, its bristles still holding a few long strands of auburn hair. An oval frame lay face down, the photograph inside too painful to look at most days. Gone 3 years. Wife and son, both. Taken in what folks called a flash flood, though, Silas had his doubts about that story. Doubts he'd never voiced aloud, not even to himself most of the time. But they lived in his gut like a sickness, festering, never quite healing. He'd stopped living after that. Oh, his body kept moving, kept working, kept breathing. But the part of him that connected to other people, that part had drowned right alongside Sarah and Ethan. Easier that way, safer. A man couldn't lose what he refused to hold on to. The black stallion in the corral snorted and stamped. Silas turned toward the sound, his hand dropping automatically to the knife on his belt. The horse stood at the far rail, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared, staring east toward the trail that wound up from the lower valley. Silas moved to the fence line, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. He stood beside the stallion and followed its gaze. For a long moment he saw nothing but heat shimmer rising off the rocks, nothing but the same empty landscape he looked at every day. Then something moved near the base of the eastern mesa, maybe 300 yards out. Not an animal. The movement was wrong for that, too low to the ground, too deliberate. He squinted against the slanting sunlight, one hand raised to shade his eyes. A person. Someone on the ground. Crawling. Silas vaulted the fence without conscious thought, his body responding before his mind caught up. He grabbed the water bucket from its hook by the well and started walking. Not running. Running would only waste energy in this heat. But walking fast, each stride eating up distance, his eyes never leaving that distant figure. At 200 yards he could make out more detail. Small frame, dark clothing, moving slow, dragging something. One arm working the other, trailing behind, like it wasn't properly attached anymore. At 100 yards he saw it was a woman, her dress torn across the back and shoulders hanging in strips. Barefoot, both feet leaving bloody smears on the pale dirt, knees scraped raw, one hand clawing forward, pulling her weight, the other clutched tight against her chest. At 50 yards, he slowed approaching, careful now the way he'd approach a wounded animal that might bite from pain and fear. She hadn't looked up yet, all her focus bent toward moving forward, toward his cabin visible maybe 200 yards beyond where she crawled now. 30 yards out and he could see her clearly, late 20s, maybe 30 at most. Dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat and dust. Face sunburned so bad the skin had started to peel. Lips cracked and bleeding. The dress she wore was thick black wool, the kind nuns wore, though it had been shredded until only patches remained. 20 yards. Her right thigh was swollen, the skin stretched tight and discolored, purple and red radiating out from two small punctures. Snake bite. Recent. Maybe an hour ago, maybe less. Her leg twitched involuntarily, the muscles cramping as venom spread through tissue. 10 yards. He could hear her breathing now, harsh and labored, each breath a struggle. Could see the bruises on her wrists, dark purple marks in the shape of fingers. Rope burns at her ankles. Scratches across her shoulders that looked like they came from mesquite thorns, the kind that grew thick in the arroyos, where men hid things they didn't want found. 5 yards and she finally sensed his presence. Her head came up slow, her eyes unfocused, pupils dilated from pain and venom. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a croak. He set the bucket down and knelt beside her, his movements deliberate, giving her time to see he meant no harm. Up close, she looked worse. Dehydrated, malnourished. Fever bright in her cheeks despite the chill that made her body shake. She licked her lips, tried again to speak. This time words came out, broken and desperate. "Don't just look, mister. Something bit me between my legs. You need to suck out the venom before it spreads." Silas didn't answer, didn't ask questions, didn't waste time on words that wouldn't help. He simply unbuckled the knife from his belt and drew it smooth from its sheath. The blade caught sunlight, 8 inches of steel he kept sharp enough to shave with. Her hand jerked toward him weakly, whether in protest or plea, he couldn't tell. He met her eyes for just a moment, saw the fear there mixed with resignation, saw a woman who'd already accepted she might die, but was going to fight anyway. "Not here to hurt you," he said. The first words he'd spoken aloud in maybe a week. His voice came out rough, unpracticed. "Just need to see the wound." He slid the blade through the fabric of her dress, cutting, careful, exposing her inner thigh where the bite mark sat livid and angry. 2 punctures each, about a 1/4 inch deep, spaced 1.5 inches apart. Prairie rattler, he figured. Probably struck when she stumbled into a rock pile or stepped wrong near a shaded spot where they like to rest during the heat of day. The bite set maybe 4 inches below her groin, close enough to the femoral artery to be deadly if the venom reached it. Already the flesh had started to swell, pushing up against the torn edges of the puncture wounds. Already the discoloration spread purple, fading to red, fading to angry pink. He leaned down without hesitation, placed his mouth over the wound and sucked hard. Venom and blood filled his mouth, bitter and foul. He turned his head and spat into the dirt 3 feet away, then sucked again. And again. Each time drawing out what poison he could, each time spitting it clear. Her fingers dug into the hard earth beside her head. Her back arched. And then she went limp, consciousness leaving her like air from a punctured bladder. Silas sat back on his heels and pulled his knife again. He cut a clean strip from the hem of her dress, folded it into a pad, and pressed it against the wound. Then he used another strip to tie it in place tight enough to slow the spread of venom, but not so tight it would cut off circulation entirely. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, one supporting her back and shoulders. She weighed almost nothing. Maybe 90 pounds, maybe 95. Should have been 115, 120 for a woman her size. However long she'd been running, she hadn't been eating. Her head lolled against his chest as he straightened her, breathing shallow but steady. Fever radiated from her skin, hot enough that he could feel it through his shirt. The sun sat low now, maybe an hour from full dark. He needed to move fast. The walk back to the cabin took less than 5 minutes, but each step jarred her, and each jar made her whimper without waking. He shouldered through the door and carried her straight to the cot in the corner, laying her down gentle on the bare corn husk mattress. Her head turned to one side. Her hands relaxed open. Silas moved to the stove first. The fire had died to coals hours ago. He opened the iron door, stirred the coals with a poker, added kindling in a careful stack. The dry wood caught immediately, flames climbing bright. He added 2 split logs and left the door open to let it build. While the fire grew, he went to the shelf where he kept his medicine. Glass jars lined up neat, each one labeled in his own careful hand. Poppy root, willow bark, yarrow, golden seal, whiskey. He'd learned frontier medicine from necessity during his cavalry years, watched enough men die from infected wounds to know which herbs helped and which were just old wives' tales. He took down the jar of poppy root and measured out a heaping spoonful of the dried ground root into a tin cup. The water in his kettle had gone cold, but he filled it anyway and set it on the stove to boil. While he waited, he gathered clean cloth, a bowl, and the whiskey. 20 minutes later, the water roiled in the kettle, steam rising in a steady column. He poured it over the poppy root and stirred with the handle of a spoon until the powder dissolved into a murky brown tea. The smell rose bitter and earthy, familiar. He carried the cup to the cot and knelt beside it. The woman, the nun, lay motionless except for the rise and fall of her chest. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the chill that made her muscles clench. He slid one hand beneath her neck, supporting her head, and brought the cup to her lips with the other. "Need you to drink," he said quietly. "It'll help with the pain." She didn't wake, but some deep part of her responded to his voice. Her lips parted slightly. He tipped the cup, letting the warm liquid trickle into her mouth. She gagged, once her throat working, then swallowed. He gave her more. She swallowed again. By the third try, she was drinking without prompting, her body taking what it needed, even if her conscious mind had checked out. When the cup ran empty, he lowered her head back to the mattress and set the cup aside. Then he really looked at her for the first time since bringing her inside. Looked past the immediate injury, past the obvious signs of exposure and exhaustion, and saw what lay beneath. Her wrist bore bruises in the clear shape of a man's fingers, each one distinct enough that he could have measured them. 4 on the inside of each wrist, 1 thumbprint on the outside. Someone had gripped her hard enough to leave marks that went bone deep. The kind of marks that took days to form, days of being held against her will. Her ankles showed rope burns, the skin rubbed raw, and then scabbed over, and then rubbed raw again. Probably hobbled, he figured. Tied at night so she couldn't run, kept just loose enough during the day that she could walk but not flee. Across her shoulders and upper back ran welts, some fresh and red, others older and faded to pink. Marks from a leather strap or maybe a thin branch laid on with enough force to break skin. Someone had beaten her, multiple times. The pattern suggested punishment, discipline, the methodical application of pain meant to control rather than kill. Her hands were torn up, nails broken and packed with dirt. She'd been clawing at something, climbing maybe, or digging or fighting. Clutched in her right hand, held so tight her knuckles showed white, even in unconsciousness, was a small silver rosary. The chain had broken probably during whatever violence had brought her to this state, but she held onto it like a drowning woman holds to driftwood. Silas sat back on the wooden crate he kept beside the cot and stared at her for a long moment. This woman hadn't stumbled across a rattlesnake by accident. She'd been running. Running hard and fast and desperate enough that she didn't watch where she stepped, didn't see the danger until fangs sank into her leg. Running from men, men organized enough to keep prisoners, men violent enough to beat a nun, men who wouldn't take kindly to their property escaping. He stood and walked to the window, moving the flour sack curtain aside just enough to look out at the darkening valley. Nothing moved out there. No dust rising from the trail, no campfire smoke. But that didn't mean much. Men who knew their business could travel without being seen, could hide sign well enough that even a good tracker might miss it. And if they were tracking this woman following her trail, then that trail led straight here, to his door, to the only place between here and the nearest town where she might have found help. Silas let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the cot. The woman's breathing had evened out deeper now, the poppy tea doing its work. The fever still burned in her, but not as fierce. Her leg had stopped twitching. He pulled a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed and spread it over her. Then he dragged his chair from the table over beside the cot and sat down. He didn't take off his boots, didn't change his shirt, just sat, one hand resting on the Colt revolver on his hip, and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. Outside, full darkness came on fast the way it did in the high country. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the far-off cry of a coyote. The cabin settled into night timbers, creaking as they cooled the stove, ticking as the fire burned down to embers. Silas didn't plan to sleep. Hadn't slept a full night in 3 years, not since Sarah and Ethan. Didn't see any reason to start now. Not with a woman in his house who'd brought trouble with her trouble that might come calling before dawn. He'd keep watch. He'd wait. And if trouble came, well, he knew how to deal with that too. The hours passed slow. Midnight came and went. The woman stirred once around 2 in the morning, murmuring something he couldn't make out, then settled again. The fever seemed to break around 3, her skin going from hot to merely warm sweat soaking the blanket beneath her. By the time gray light started to filter through the base and the shutters, Silas had made his decision. However this woman came to be crawling across his land, whatever she was running from, she was here now, under his roof. That made her his responsibility, at least until she healed enough to make her own choices. And if the men chasing her showed up, well, they'd learn what it cost to bring violence to a man's home. He stood and stretched his back, protesting his knee, sending sharp complaints up his leg. He added wood to the stove and set the kettle to boil for coffee. Then he stood at the window again, watching the valley wake up, watching for movement that didn't belong. Behind him, the woman on the cot drew a deeper breath, held it, then exhaled slow. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Not yet, but soon. And when she woke, he'd find out just what kind of trouble he'd invited into his life. The sun cleared the eastern mesa, throwing long shadows across the valley floor. Morning birds started their calls tentative at first, then building to full voice. The world returned to something like normal, at least on the surface. But Silas Bridger had learned long ago that surfaces lied. The real truth of things lived deeper in the spaces between what people said and what they did, between what they showed and what they hid. This woman had secrets, had pain, had a story written in bruises and scars and broken things clutched in desperate hands. And whether he wanted it or not, that story was now tangled up with his own. He poured himself coffee, black and bitter, and waited for her to wake. The room smelled of wood smoke and iron and something medicinal from the poppy tea. Dust motes drifted through the morning light. The stove ticked as metal expanded with heat. Everything was ordinary. Everything was normal, except for the woman on the cot, except for the violence she carried with her, except for the certainty growing in his gut that quiet days were over. Silas sipped his coffee and kept watching the valley, kept waiting. The woman on the cot stirred around mid-morning, her breathing changing rhythm, consciousness returning in stages. First her fingers twitched, then her eyelids fluttered. Then she drew a sharp breath, and her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. Silas didn't move from his position by the stove, didn't speak. Just let her wake up at her own pace, let her take in her surroundings without feeling threatened. She blinked several times, her gaze moving from the rough timber ceiling to the walls to the stove to him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She tried to sit up, and pain lanced through her sharp enough that she gasped and fell back against the mattress. "Careful," Silas said, his voice quiet. "You're at my place. Came in with a steak bite yesterday evening. Almost didn't make it." She turned her head towards him, really seeing him now. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, the color of creek stones, and sharp despite the pain and confusion. Eyes that had seen too much. "How long?" Her voice came out as a rasp, her throat dry as dust. "Since dusk yesterday. Fever broke around dawn. You're past the worst of it." She looked down at herself, at the torn black dress, at the bandage on her thigh. Her hands moved to touch it, and he saw her wince. "You looked," she said. Not a question, not quite an accusation, just stating fact. "Had to," Silas said. "No other way." She nodded once, accepting this. Her eyes moved around the cabin again, cataloging details. The organized tools, the medicine jars, the rifle in the corner, the closed trunk, the shelf with its painful mementos. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 40 miles north of Silver Creek, if you know it, close to the base of the San Miguel Range." "Colorado territory." "That's right." She closed her eyes for a moment, some calculation happening behind her lids. When she opened them again, they were clearer, more focused. Water. Silas filled a tin cup from the pitcher on the counter and brought it to her. He supported her head while she drank, one hand gentle behind her neck. She drained the cup in long swallows, some of it spilling down her chin. When she finished, he lowered her back down. More, he asked. Please. He refilled it and she drank again, slower this time. When she'd had enough, she turned her head away and he set the cup aside. Thank you. Silas nodded, walked back to the stove, busied himself with pouring coffee. He didn't want giving her time to gather herself. I need to know your name, she said after a while. The man who saved my life. I should know his name. Silas Bridger. Silas, she repeated, testing it. I'm Grace, Sister Grace Hartwell, from the Sisters of Mercy. Sister. Was, she said quietly. Maybe still am. Hard to say after everything. They didn't shake hands. The formality seemed wrong, somehow unnecessary. They had already been through something more intimate than introductions, his mouth on her wound, his hands on her body, her life held in his competence. You're alone here, Grace asked. I am. No wife, no children. Silas's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the shelf, to the toys and brush and photograph he couldn't bear to look at straight on. Gone 3 years, he said. Grace followed his gaze, saw what sat there, understood. I'm sorry. Everyone loses someone. The words came out harder than he meant them. He softened his tone, tried again. You lose people or they lose you. That's just how it goes. Grace nodded. She understood loss. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her hand moved to touch the broken rosary chain she still clutched. Are you going to ask me? She said. What happened? How I got here? When you're ready to tell me. She blinked, surprised. You don't want to know. Didn't say that, said when you're ready. A long moment passed. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust through the gaps in the walls. A crow called from somewhere near the corral. I was with a mission group, Grace said finally. 4 nuns, 2 priests, heading west to establish a school. We were attacked 2 days north of here. I ran. That's all. Silas heard everything she didn't say, heard it in the gaps between her words, in the careful way she chose what to share. She'd been with people who were now dead. She'd witnessed something terrible. She was leaving out details that would paint her attackers as more than random bandits. But he didn't press. She'd tell the rest when she was ready, or she wouldn't. Either way, it didn't change what needed doing right now. You hungry? Grace considered. I don't know, maybe. I'll make something. You should eat. He set about preparing a simple meal, moving around the cabin with practiced efficiency. Beans soaked overnight went into a pot with salt pork and onion. Cornbread batter mixed up quick, poured into a skillet, set in the oven. Coffee kept hot on the back of the stove. Grace watched him work. After a while, she said, You were military. Scout, cavalry, 20 years. That's where you learn medicine. Some rest I picked up living rough. Man learns what he needs to stay alive. You're not from here originally. Kansas way back, been in the territory since '61. The war. The war, he agreed. They fell quiet again. The cabin filled with the smell of cooking food, warm and simple and ordinary. Grace's stomach growled loud enough that Silas heard it from across the room. She blushed. Been a while since you ate proper, he said. Longer than I want to think about. When the food was ready, he filled 2 tin plates and brought one to her. She struggled to sit up, and this time he helped his hands under her arms, lifting her, careful. He wedged a folded blanket behind her back for support. She ate slowly, each bite deliberate, as if she'd forgotten how food was supposed to taste. The beans and pork disappeared first. Then the cornbread torn into pieces and soaked in the bean liquid. When her plate was clean, she set it aside and leaned back, exhausted from the simple effort of eating. That's the best meal I've had in weeks, she said. It's beans. It's the best meal I've had in weeks, she repeated firmly. Silas took her plate and washed both in the basin, using water heated on the stove and a rag worn soft from use. When the dishes were clean and stacked, he returned to his chair beside the cot. Your leg needs checking, he said. I need to change the bandage, make sure infection hasn't set in. Grace's hand moved to cover the bandage, not protective exactly, just acknowledging what he was asking. All right. He untied the cloth strips and peeled back the pad he'd placed over the wound. The flesh around the bite had gone from purple to a mottled yellow and green, the normal progression as venom broke down tissue. The swelling had reduced some. Most importantly, the red streaks that would indicate infection spreading weren't present. "Looks good," he said. "Snake didn't hit anything vital. Venom's working through your system, but you'll heal clean." He cleaned the wound with whiskey, applied fresh golden seal paste, and rebandaged it with cloth he'd boiled that morning. His hands were gentle but impersonal, a doctor's touch rather than anything else. When he finished, he sat back. "You should rest. Sleep if you can. Your body needs time." "I've been sleeping." "You've been unconscious. That's different." Grace smiled slightly. "You always this bossy?" "Only when people need bossing." She settled back against the blanket, her eyelids already heavy. The poppy tea had worked through her system, the food had taken what energy she'd mustered, and exhaustion claimed her quick. Silas watched until her breathing evened into sleep. Then he stood and moved to the window, looking out at the valley that lay peaceful and quiet under the midday sun. She'd brought trouble with her. He was sure of that now. Men who organized missions didn't get attacked by chance. Men who kept nuns prisoner were organized, probably well-armed, definitely dangerous. And if they wanted her dead or back under their control, they'd be tracking her. 3 years he'd lived here in silence. 3 years of nothing but his own thoughts and his own ghosts. 3 years of choosing isolation over the pain of connection. And now this woman had crashed into his life, bloody and desperate, and running from violence he could feel brewing like a summer storm. Part of him, the part that had shut down when Sarah and Ethan died, wanted to put Grace on a horse the moment she could ride and send her on her way. Cut clean from whatever mess she'd brought. Go back to his quiet half-life of work and memory and slow decline. But another part, older and deeper, the part that still remembered what it meant to be a man of honor, knew he couldn't do that. She'd come to him for help even if she hadn't known she was doing it. She'd crawled bleeding across his land and collapsed on his doorstep. That made her his responsibility. Not forever. Just until she healed. Just until she could make her own choice about where to go next. And if trouble came while she was here, well, he still had his rifle. Still had his cavalry training. Still remembered how to deal with men who brought violence to a peaceful place. He'd defended this cabin once when he first built it and claimed jumpers tried to run him off. Sent 2 of them away with bullets in their legs and a third in a shallow grave. Word got around after that. People left Silas Bridger alone. He'd do it again if he had to. The afternoon wore on. Grace slept through most of it, waking once to use the chamber pot he'd provided, then falling immediately back into exhausted sleep. Silas went about his normal work, checking on the horses, hauling water from the spring, splitting more wood for the eternal hunger of the stove. But every few minutes he found himself stopping, listening, scanning the valley for movement that didn't belong. Nothing yet. But it would come. He felt it in his bones, in the way the back of his neck prickled, in the restless circling of the black stallion in the corral. Trouble was coming. The only questions were when and how much and whether he'd be ready. By the 3rd day, Grace could stand without help. Her legs still ached, the wound site tender and hot to touch, but the swelling had gone down enough that she could put weight on it. She hobbled to the window on the crutch Silas had carved for her, a simple piece of pine, smooth in shape to fit under her arm, and looked out at the valley she'd crawled through half dead. In daylight, with clear eyes, she could see what she'd missed in her desperate flight. The cabin sat in a natural amphitheater, protected on 3 sides by rising stone walls. The eastern approach offered the only easy access, a gentle slope that climbed from the lower valley. Good defensive position. A military man's choice. "You picked this spot careful," she said without turning. Silas looked up from the harness he was mending, needle and thread, moving through leather with practiced precision. "Had my reasons. Easy to defend." "That too," she turned to face him. "You were expecting trouble when you built here." "Always expect trouble. That way you're ready when it comes." Grace studied him in the morning light slanting through the window. 3 days together and she'd learned to read him some. The set of his shoulders told her his mood. The tightness around his eyes showed when old pain crept up on him. The way his hand never strayed far from the revolver on his hip spoke to habits formed over decades. He was a hard man, hard from years of violence and loss, but not cruel. Never cruel. Every action he took toward her had been marked by a gentleness that seemed at odds with the scars on his knuckles and the efficient way he handled weapons. "I need to help," she said. "I can't just lie in bed while you work." "You need to heal." "I can do both." He set down the harness and looked at her straight on. What did you have in mind? Whatever needs doing. I grew up on a farm. I know how to work. Silas considered this. Can you feed horses? Yes. Check their hooves for stones. Yes. Muck out a stall. If you give me a shovel and point me at it, something that might have been approval crossed his face. All right then, but you push too hard, you open that wound again, and you're back in bed for another week. Understood. They worked through the morning together, Grace moving slow but determined, Silas keeping an eye on her without being obvious about it. She fed the 3 horses he kept, the big black stallion and 2 mares, one chestnut and one gray. She checked their water troughs and discovered one had cracked, leaking water into the dirt below. She pointed it out to Silas and he nodded, filing it away as something to fix. By noon she was exhausted, her leg throbbing, sweat soaking through her dress despite the cool mountain air. But she'd made herself useful. That mattered. Being useful meant she wasn't just a burden, meant she had value beyond the trouble she'd brought. They ate a simple lunch of leftover beans and hard biscuits. Grace sat at the table instead of the cot, a small victory. After they'd eaten, she asked the question that had been building in her since she woke. The people who were with me, the other sisters, the priests, you asked where I came from, but you didn't ask about them. Silas set down his coffee. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I'm ready. He waited, his gray eyes steady on hers. There were 6 of us, Grace began. 4 nuns, including me. Father Thomas was leading. Father Benedict was our guide. We were heading west to establish a school in a mining settlement. The diocese had provided funds for construction, $3,000 in gold coin. She paused, her hands wrapping tight around her tin cup. We were attacked at dawn 4 days ago, maybe 5. I lost track. They came out of the rocks on both sides of the canyon, 6 men, maybe 7. They knew exactly where we'd be. They set up in positions that gave them overlapping fire. Her voice stayed steady, but her knuckles went white on the cup. Father Thomas tried to negotiate. He stepped forward with his hands raised. Their leader shot him in the chest, just like that. No warning, no demands, just shot him and watched him fall. Silas didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. Then a man in a long coat stepped forward. I couldn't see his face well from where I'd gone to gather herbs, but I heard his voice. He demanded to know where the gold was hidden. Father Benedict, Grace stopped, swallowed hard. He pointed. He showed them the wagon. He was in on it. The whole thing was a setup. The guide betrayed you. Yes, but it didn't save him. Once they had the gold, the leader shot Father Benedict too. Said something about not leaving witnesses. Then he shot Marshal Hayes. Silas straightened in his chair. Marshal. Federal Marshal. David Hayes. He'd been escorting us in secret. The diocese had requested protection because of the gold. He was dressed like a teamster, but he was law. They shot him and took his badge. The air in the cabin changed. Something sharp and dangerous entered it. Sisters Anne and Margaret tried to run. They shot them in the back. I was far enough away, hidden in the rocks. I watched it all happen, and I couldn't do anything. Couldn't stop it. Couldn't save them. Tears tracked down her face, but her voice never broke. They searched the wagons, took everything valuable. Then they set fire to what was left. I waited until they rode away. Then I ran. Ran for 2 days before I stepped on that snake. Silas sat very still. You saw the leader's face. Yes, close enough. He was older, 45, maybe 50, gray at the temples, wore a Confederate officer's coat, carried himself like military, like he'd commanded men before. You could identify him, so in a courtroom, under oath, yes. Then they'll come for you, have to. You're the only witness to a federal marshal's murder. That's a hanging offense no matter who you are. Grace nodded. I know, that's why I kept running even after the bite. I knew they'd track me. They sat in silence for a long minute. Outside, a hawk screamed somewhere high up in the clear air. The man who came here last night, Silas said. You recognized his horse. The brand, Circle G on the left flank. Same as the horses the men were riding. You didn't say anything. I was terrified. I'm terrified. These men, they're not common bandits. They're organized, professional, and they want me dead. Silas stood and walked to the window. Then we'd better get ready, because they'll be back, and next time they won't come alone. Grace felt something shift in her, some tight knot of fear loosening, just a fraction. This isn't your fight. He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something fierce and bright in his eyes. Something that had been buried but not dead. You're on my land, under my roof, that makes it my fight. That night, the fourth night since Grace's arrival, Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window with his rifle across his knees and watched the darkness. Grace had asked to stay up with him, but he'd refused, told her she needed rest to heal. She'd argued until she saw the set of his jaw, then given up and retreated to the cot. But she didn't sleep either. She lay in the darkness listening to the night sounds, the creak of timbers, the whisper of wind through cracks in the walls, the distant call of an owl hunting the valley floor. Around 2 in the morning she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, something scraping against wood. Not the random scratch of a branch, deliberate, careful. Her eyes snapped open. Across the room, Silas was already moving, fluid and silent, the rifle coming up to his shoulder. He caught her gaze and put one finger to his lips. Grace slid from the cot as quietly as she could, reaching for the pistol Silas had shown her that afternoon, teaching her how to load it, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull. The weight of it felt foreign and heavy in her hand. Silas moved to the door, pressed himself against the wall beside it, listening. The scraping came again, then footsteps soft but audible moving around the cabin toward the corral. He eased the door open an inch. Moonlight spilled across the threshold, bright enough to see by. Outside, maybe 30 yards away, a figure moved through the darkness. Man-sized, checking the fence line, testing posts, reading the ground. Grace moved up behind Silas, close enough to see past his shoulder. The figure wore dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. He led a horse, walking it slow and quiet. As he passed through a shaft of moonlight, Grace's breath caught. The horse, bay gelding, Circle G brand on the left flank. She touched Silas's shoulder, and when he glanced back, she nodded. Same men, same gang. The scout had returned. Silas pushed the door wider and stepped out onto the porch, rifle ready. His voice cut through the night, hard and flat. Step away from that fence. The figure froze, turned slow with hands visible but not raised. Even in the darkness, Grace could see the confident way he held himself. Not frightened, not even particularly concerned. Easy, friend. Oh, and the voice came smooth and practiced. Just looking for a place to bed down for the night. You've been circling this property for 3 nights. That's not looking. That's scouting. A pause, then a low chuckle. You're sharper than you look, old man. Cavalry scout, 7th Regiment. I know what reconnaissance looks like. The man's posture changed, more alert now. Cavalry, that explains the setup here. Good defensive position. What do you want? Like I said, just a place to rest. There's 50 miles of empty country out there. You don't need my property. Another pause. The man shifted weight, his eyes moving past Silas to the cabin window where Grace stood watching. Interesting. You've got yourself a visitor. Silas's voice went colder. What I've got is none of your concern. See, that's where you're wrong. My boss, he's looking for something or someone, small thing, dark hair, probably hurt, probably running scared. You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone like that. Grace's heart hammered. She gripped the pistol tighter. Get off my land, Silas said. The man smiled, teeth white in the darkness. We'll be back. When Dalton Garrett wants something, he gets it. You might want to think about that. Think about whether one woman is worth dying over. Garrett? Silas repeated the name like he was tasting poison. Dalton Garrett. The very same. Former captain, Union Cavalry. Now he runs his own operation. Successful man. Not someone you want to cross. We're done talking. Mount up and ride. If I see you on my property again, I'll shoot you on sight. The man studied him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. Your funeral, old-timer. He swung into the saddle with easy grace and turned the horse. Before riding away, he looked back one more time. Tell the little nun she can't run forever. We always catch what we're hunting. Then he was gone, hoofbeats fading into the darkness. Silas stood on the porch for another 5 minutes, rifle ready, scanning the valley. When he finally came back inside, Grace was sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around the pistol, shaking. That was Virgil Webb, she said. He was second in command. I saw him at the massacre. Silas set his rifle down and lit the lantern. Warm light filled the cabin. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Tell me everything. Start at the beginning. Leave nothing out. So she did. The whole story this time holding nothing back. The mission's purpose. The gold meant for building a school. Father Benedict's treachery. The careful ambush. Marshal Hayes drawing his weapon too late. The cold, methodical murder of everyone who'd seen too much. And the leader, Dalton Garrett, former Union captain, military bearing, gray temples, Confederate coat worn like a statement, the way he'd shot Father Benedict after using him, the way he'd examined the marshal's badge before pocketing it, the way he'd ordered his men to search for survivors. I hid in the rocks for 6 hours, Grace said, until I was sure they were gone. Then I started walking. I thought I could reach a town, find help, but they sent riders to track me. I heard horses behind me on the second day. That's when I started running. Ran until my feet were bloody. Ran until I couldn't breathe. And then I stepped on that rattlesnake and thought I was finished. Silas listened without interruption. When she finished, he sat quiet for a long time, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Finally, he said, when you mentioned a raid 3 years ago, families killed, you saw something in my face. Yes. I need to tell you something. Need you to understand what this is really about. He stood and walked to the shelf where the child's toy and the hairbrush sat. He picked up the oval frame, the one that lay face down, and looked at it for the first time in months. Then he brought it to the table and set it in front of Grace. A wedding photograph. A younger Silas, clean-shaven and serious, standing beside a auburn-haired woman with kind eyes. In front of them, a boy, maybe 7 years old, grinning wide. Sarah and Ethan, Silas said. My wife and son. They're beautiful. 3 years ago, I was scouting for a cavalry escort. Federal gold shipment heading to Denver. Big one. 50,000 in coins. I was hired because I knew every trail in this part of the territory. Every water source. Every place an ambush might come from. He sat back down, his hands flat on the table. The operation was commanded by Captain Dalton Garrett, Union cavalry, decorated officer, man with a perfect record. I thought working for him was an honor. Grace's eyes widened as she understood. I left Sarah and Ethan at our old cabin down by the river. Figured they'd be safer away from the gold route. Told them I'd be back in a week. The escort went smooth. Too smooth looking back. We reached Denver, delivered the gold, no trouble at all. Then 3 days later, Garrett vanished. Took $20,000 with him. They said he'd deserted, fled to Mexico. His voice went flat, empty. While I was gone, someone hit the cabin. I came home to ashes. The local marshal told me it was Cheyenne raiders. Said they'd caught Sarah and Ethan in a flash flood trying to escape. Bodies were swept downriver, never recovered. Oh God, Grace whispered. But there was no Cheyenne sign, and the flood didn't come until 2 days after they died. The timeline was wrong, the story was wrong. I told the marshal, but he said I was crazy with grief. Maybe I was. I couldn't prove anything. Couldn't even prove there'd been raiders, so I built this place, dug in, tried to forget. But you couldn't. No, and now Garrett's here, not in Mexico, here in the territory, still operating, still killing. And I think I know why he killed my family. To stop you from tracking him. I was the best, everyone knew it. If I'd gone after him, I would have found him. So he eliminated the threat before I even knew there was one. Made it look like an accident. Broke me so thoroughly I wouldn't come looking. Grace reached across the table and put her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough and scarred. Then this is both our fights, she said. He took everything from both of us. Silas looked at their hands, hers small and pale, against his. He didn't pull away. He's going to come for you, probably bring his whole crew. We can't defend against 8 or 10 men, not for long. Then what do? We get ready and we make them pay for every inch. The next 3 days moved in a blur of preparation. At first light, Silas took Grace outside and taught her to shoot properly. Not just loading and aiming, but stance, breathing, follow through. He set up targets at various distances and made her practice until her hands cramped. "You've done this before," he said, after she put 3 rounds in a tight group at 20 yards. "My father was a sharpshooter in the war. Union. He taught me when I was young. Said every woman should know how to defend herself. Smart man. The church didn't approve. Said violence had no place in a woman's hands. I stopped practicing after I took my vows." "Your vows say anything about dying meek," Grace smiled grimly. "They said a lot of things that seem less important after watching nuns murdered for witnessing a crime." "Fair enough. They spent hours on the rifle too, a Henry repeater that could fire 15 rounds without reloading." Grace's shoulder ached from the recoil, but she kept at it, her jaw set determined. Between shooting practice, they fortified the cabin. Silas showed her how to reinforce the shutters with crossbars, how to position furniture to create cover, how to fill water barrels inside in case of siege. They moved ammunition to strategic spots, pre-positioned rifles and pistols where they could be grabbed quick. "You've done this before," Grace said, echoing his words back to him. "Defended a structure under attack few times. Cavalry teaches you that. And after cavalry, had some trouble with claim jumpers when I first built here. 3 men thought they could run me off. Sent 2 away wounded. Buried the 3rd out past the north fence." Grace looked at him in the afternoon sunlight, this quiet man who had saved her life, and saw him clearly for what he was. Not just a hermit, not just a grieving widower. A warrior who'd set aside his weapons but never forgotten how to use them. "I'm glad you're on my side," she said. Something flickered in his eyes, maybe surprise, maybe something warmer. "I'm glad you can shoot. Be a lot harder to defend this place alone." They worked side by side, their movements falling into rhythm. Grace learned to read his gestures to understand when he wanted a tool or a board or a handful of nails. Silas learned to trust her strength, stop trying to do everything himself, let her carry weight even when her legs still pained her. On the 5th day, Grace fixed the broken water trough, then moved on to a section of corral fence that sagged dangerously. She measured and cut new rails, fitted them into place, hammered nails with sure strokes. The work felt good, felt like claiming space, felt like making something permanent in a world that had taken everything temporary from her. Silas watched from the barn doorway, a small smile tugging at his mouth. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the western mesa, they sat on the porch together. The valley glowed orange and gold. A hawk circled high above hunting. The air smelled of dust and sage and the distant promise of rain. "This place," Grace said, "it doesn't feel temporary anymore." "Never was meant to be," Silas replied. "At least not for me. Maybe not just for you." He looked at her, then really looked, and she met his gaze steady. Something unspoken passed between them, too fragile to name but real nonetheless. "You ever think about giving it a name?" Grace asked. "The ranch." "No. Feels like it should have one, something that means what it is." "What would you call it?" Grace gazed out at the darkening valley, at the 2 mesas standing guard on either side at the cabin that had sheltered her when she had nothing left. "Safe enough," she said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted. A place that was safe enough." Silas went still beside her. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Safe enough. I like that." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. The temperature dropped, and Grace shivered. Silas disappeared into the cabin and returned with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders without a word. The next morning, Grace found a wooden plaque leaning against the porch rail. The letters carved into it were rough but legible. "Safe enough." She picked it up, ran her fingers over the words. Silas came around the corner of the cabin carrying a hammer and nails. "Figured if we're naming it, we should make it official," he said. Together, they mounted the plaque on the gatepost at the property's entrance. It wasn't fancy, wasn't painted or varnished, but it meant something. It meant this place belonged to them both now. That evening, Grace cooked a real meal, not just heated up beans, but something closer to what she remembered from before. She found flour in the pantry and made bread that rose properly. She found dried herbs and flavored the beans with cumin and pepper. She cut the cornbread into neat squares instead of breaking it rough. When Silas came in from checking the horses, he stopped in the doorway just breathing in the smells. "This is what a home smells like," he said. They ate at the table, the good food and the quiet company, making the cabin feel different. Warmer, fuller, less like a place to survive and more like a place to live. After the dishes were washed and put away, Grace gathered her courage and asked the question that had been building. When this is over, if we survive, what will you do? Silas set down his coffee. Haven't thought that far ahead. Think about it now. He looked at her across the table. Rebuild what gets damaged. Make this place stronger. Make it last. Alone. The word hung between them. Maybe not, he said finally. Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The chance that life might hold more than just survival. That wounds might heal. That two broken people might build something whole together. I'd like that, she said. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. I'd like that too. They sat in the lamplight, not touching, but closer than they'd been, and let themselves imagine a future that extended beyond the next fight, beyond the next threat. Let themselves imagine peace. It lasted until the 8th night. Grace woke to silence. The kind of silence that screamed danger to anyone who knew how to listen. No night birds, no insects. Even the wind had died. Just stillness, thick and wrong. She sat up slow, reaching for the pistol on the crate beside the cot. Across the room, Silas was already at the window, rifle in hand, barely breathing. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming fast from the east. They're here, Silas said. Grace swung her legs off the cot, ignoring the stab of pain from her healing wound. She moved to the second window, pistol ready, heart hammering. How many? 4 that I can see, maybe more hanging back. Moonlight illuminated the valley bright as day. 4 riders emerged from the tree line, spread out in a line, moving at a canter toward the cabin. They weren't trying to hide, weren't trying to sneak. This was a show of force. The riders pulled up 50 yards from the cabin, horses stamping and blowing. One of them rode forward another 10 yards. Even at that distance, Grace recognized him. Virgil Webb. Bridger, his voice carried clear in the still air. You had your warning, time to make a choice. Send out the nun and we'll leave you be, otherwise you're going to have a bad night. Silas didn't answer immediately. He scanned the darkness beyond the riders, looking for others hidden in the shadows. Found movement to the south, another horse and rider. To the north, same thing. 6 total then, maybe 7. You've got 10 seconds, Virgil shouted. Then we come get her. Silas looked at Grace. You ready for this? She checked her pistol, making sure a round sat in the chamber. Her hands were steady. Her fear had burned away, leaving something colder and harder behind. I'm ready. Silas turned back to the window, raised his rifle, and gave his answer the only way that mattered. He fired. The shot cracked through the night. Virgil's horse reared the round, passing close enough that the man felt the wind of it. He fought the animal down, his face twisted with rage. Wrong choice, old man. Wrong choice. The riders split, 2 going left, 2 going right, circling the cabin. The ones hidden in the trees moved forward. It had begun. Silas tracked the rightmost rider, led him just enough, fired. The Henry kicked against his shoulder. The rider jerked, slumped in the saddle, but didn't fall. Wounded, not dead. The horse kept running, carrying its injured burden toward the barn. Grace fired through her window at the riders coming left. Her first shot went wide. Her second found the horse, not the rider. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider hard. The man rolled, came up, limping dove behind the water trough. 1 down, 1 behind cover, Grace reported. 1 wounded heading for the barn, Silas replied. 2 more coming around back. Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets punched through the shutters, thudded into log walls, shattered the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam. Glass rained down. The cabin filled with gun smoke and the smell of burned powder. Silas fired methodically, working the lever, action, smooth and fast. The Henry held 15 rounds, and he made each one count. Another rider went down. Another horse spooked and ran. But more kept coming. Grace saw flame bloom in the darkness to the south. A rider had dismounted and was building something, working fast. Then she understood. Fire. They were going to burn them out. They're torching the hay pile by the barn, Silas cursed. The hay was dry as tinder. If it caught properly, the barn would go up. Then the cabin. Then they'd be trapped between fire and bullets. Keep shooting, he shouted. Don't let them get close. Grace fired at the man building the fire. Missed. Fired again. This time he jerked and dropped. but the flames had already caught licking up through the dried grass and reaching for the hay pile. Orange light bloomed across the yard, turning night into hellish day. Shadows leaped and danced. The horses in the protected ravine beyond screamed their fear. A man appeared at Grace's window trying to climb through. She didn't hesitate, raised the pistol, fired point blank. The man's head snapped back and he fell away into the darkness. "I hit him," she gasped. "I killed him." "Good," Silas shouted over the gunfire. "Don't think, just reload." Her hands shook as she broke open the pistol, dumped spent shells fed in fresh rounds. Muscle memory from her father's training took over. Click, close, cock, ready. The door exploded inward. Wood splinters flew. A man burst through, pistol raised. Silas spun from the window and the two of them collided. The rifle clattered away. They went down in a tangle, rolling, punching, each trying to gain advantage. The attacker was younger, stronger. But Silas had fought hand to hand for 20 years. He twisted, brought his knee up hard into the man's groin. As the man doubled over, Silas grabbed his head and slammed it into the floor. Once, twice. On the third impact, something cracked and the man went limp. Silas grabbed his rifle and was back at the window in seconds, bleeding from a cut over his eye, but still fighting. Outside, the barn was fully involved now, flames reaching 30 feet into the air. The heat drove back, the attackers made them silhouettes against the orange glow. Virgil Webb appeared on horseback, illuminated by fire, shouting orders. Pull back, and regroup." 3 riders emerged from the shadows, 2 supporting a 4th who slumped in his saddle. They gathered to Virgil and conferred quickly, then started to withdraw. Silas fired after them, not trying for kills, now just driving them off. The Henry clicked empty, and he didn't bother reloading, just let them go. The hoofbeats faded. The yard fell silent, except for the roar of flames consuming the barn. Grace sagged against the wall, the pistol heavy in her hands. Is it over? For now, they'll be back. They watched the barn burn, its skeleton collapsing in showers of sparks. The horses were safe far enough away that the fire couldn't reach them. But the structure was lost. The hay was lost. Come winter, feeding would be harder. But they were alive. As dawn broke gray and cold over the valley, Silas and Grace performed the grim work of checking the bodies. 3 dead attackers lay scattered across the yard, the one at Grace's window, the one Silas had brained in the cabin, a third who'd bled out behind the water trough. They dragged them away from the cabin far enough that the smell wouldn't reach the house. Christian burial would come later. Right now, they were just dealing with immediate problems. While searching the body of the man from the water trough, Silas stopped. His hands, red with another man's blood, started to shake. Grace looked over and saw him holding something. A silver locket on a chain. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, 2 photographs. A woman with auburn hair and kind eyes. A boy, maybe 8 years old, grinning wide at the camera. Sarah and Ethan, his family, the family he'd lost. This man, Silas's voice came out strangled. This man took this from my wife's body 3 years ago. He was there. He was part of it. Grace went to him, put her hand on his shoulder. Then Garrett really did order it, and this proves it. Silas closed the locket and slipped it into his pocket. When he looked up at her, his eyes held something she'd never seen before. Not grief, not pain, cold, focused rage. They're going to pay, he said quietly. Every single one of them. I'm going to make them pay. Grace squeezed his shoulder. We both will. They stood together in the ruins of the barn as the sun climbed higher, as smoke drifted across the valley, as the reality of what they'd survived and what still lay ahead settled over them like ash. The battle had been won, but the war had just begun. The dawn after the first attack came cold and gray clouds rolling in from the high peaks, promising rain that might never arrive. Silas stood in the smoking ruins of what had been his barn, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen worse but felt this deeper. The structure was gone, timbers reduced to charcoal, the hay pile completely consumed. Metal tools and tack hardware lay scattered among the ashes, twisted and blackened. He could rebuild, had the skills and the will. But rebuilding took time, and time was something they might not have. Grace emerged from the cabin carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. Her limp had worsened overnight from all the movement during the fight, but she pushed through it. She handed him 1 cup and stood beside him. both of them looking at the destruction in silence. "How long do we have?" she asked finally. "Day, maybe two. Depends on how many men Garrett lost and how mad he is about losing them. He'll come back with everyone." "Yes." "Can we hold—" Silas sipped the bitter coffee. "Depends on how many everyone is. If it's 6 or 7, maybe. If it's 10 or 12, we'll need luck." Grace looked at the cabin, at the new bullet holes in the bunks, at the shattered window shutters they'd need to repair. "There's another option. Running." "Yes." "You want to run?" She turned to face him. "No, but I don't want you dying for me either." Silas met her eyes. "I'm not dying for you. I'm fighting for me. For Sarah and Ethan. For 3 years of living half dead because I didn't know who to blame. Now I know. Now I can finish it. And if we lose, then we lose together. But we make them pay for every inch of ground. We make them remember that coming after us cost them blood." Grace nodded slowly. "All right then. What do we do?" They spent the 9th day in a frenzy of preparation. Every moment mattered now. Every nail driven, every board placed, every round of ammunition positioned could mean the difference between holding and falling. Silas showed Grace how to create fallback positions inside the cabin. If the main room became untenable, they'd retreat to the corner where the stove sat using the cast iron as cover. If that failed, they'd go through the back window to the root cellar, a small dugout he'd excavated for storing vegetables in winter. "Never let them trap you in one position," he explained. "Always have a way out. Always have the next move planned." Then they pre-positioned weapons at each station. Rifle and pistol at the main windows. Shotgun behind the stove. Extra pistol hidden in the root cellar, along with ammunition and water. If they had to run, they'd at least run armed. Grace suggested setting up a false campfire in the clearing south of the cabin. "Draw them in," she said. "Make them think we're not expecting them." Silas considered this. "Good thinking. We build it with green wood so it smokes but doesn't burn clean. Make it look like amateurs made it." Will they fall for it? Maybe, maybe not. But it might make them overconfident. Overconfident men make mistakes. They dug shallow rifle pits at strategic points around the property positions with overlapping fields of fire. Covered them with brush to hide them from casual observation. Filled bottles with coal oil and stuffed rags in the necks. If it came to close quarters, fire might be their last weapon. The black stallion and the 2 mares remained hidden in the ravine where they'd moved them during the first attack. Silas checked on them twice, making sure they had water and forage. The animals were nervous, sensing something wrong, but they were safe. That mattered. Whatever happened to the humans, the horses would survive. As the sun dropped toward the western mesa, Grace and Silas worked side by side, reinforcing the cabin door. The first attack had splintered it. Now they added cross braces, heavy timbers that would take a battering ram to break through. Grace hammered nails with steady rhythm. Silas held the boards in place. Their movements synchronized, each anticipating what the other needed before words became necessary. This was partnership forged under fire trust built through shared danger. When the door was secure, Silas stepped back and examined their work. "That'll hold. Will it be enough?" "Has to be." They ate a simple meal as darkness fell. Neither had much appetite, but they forced food down anyway. Bodies needed fuel to fight. Grace had learned that the hard way during her 2 days of running after the massacre. After they'd cleaned the dishes, Grace sat at the table and watched Silas methodically check every weapon in the cabin. He'd done this twice already that day, but he did it again. Loading, unloading, working actions, making sure each piece functioned perfectly. "You're worried," Grace said. "I'm prepared. There's a difference. But you think they'll come tomorrow." Silas set down the rifle he'd been examining. "Yes, tonight would be too soon. They need time to regroup, treat wounded, convince themselves they can win. Tomorrow at dawn. That's when I'd come if I were them." "What are our chances?" He looked at her across the table, this woman who'd crashed into his life barely more than a week ago. This woman who'd somehow become essential to it. "Honestly, maybe a little worse. But we've got advantages. We know the ground. We're fighting from cover. And we're fighting for something that matters." What do they fight for? Pride, money, the need to tie up loose ends. But that's not the same as fighting for home. Grace reached across and took his hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. These past days, What you've given me. The chance to be strong again, to be useful to matter. That's worth whatever comes next. Silas squeezed her hand. You always mattered. You just needed a place safe enough to remember that. They sat in the lamplight, hands joined across the scarred wood of the table, and let the moment stretch. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain that still refused to fall. Inside, the cabin felt warm and solid and real, a bulwark against chaos. Eventually, Grace stood. I should sleep. Tomorrow will be long. I'll take first watch. Wake me in 3 hours. You need rest too. He nodded, but they both knew he wouldn't wake her. Some habits ran too deep. 3 years of not sleeping, 3 years of keeping watch alone that didn't change in a week. Grace settled on the cot, the pistol within reach on the crate. She closed her eyes, but sleep came slow. Every sound made her tense. Every creak of timber or whisper of wind might be the enemy returning. But eventually exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy dreams of fire and smoke, and men with guns who wore the faces of people she'd once trusted. Silas sat in his chair by the window, with the rifle across his knees, and watched the night. Clouds obscured the moon, now turning the valley into a landscape of shadows. Good for defense. Hard for attackers to approach unseen when they couldn't see either. Around 2 in the morning, the rain finally came. Not the violent storm the clouds had promised, but a steady drizzle that would turn the ground to mud and make horses slip. Another advantage. Silas allowed himself a thin smile. At 4, he added wood to the stove, keeping the fire low but steady. They'd need warmth when the sun rose. Would need coffee to keep hands steady and mind sharp. At 5, Grace woke without prompting. She didn't speak, just rose and went to her position at the side window. Silas heard her checking her weapons, heard the familiar sound of rounds sliding into chambers. At 6, the rain stopped. The clouds began to break, allowing pale dawn light to filter through. Mist rose from the wet ground in ghostly columns. At 6:30, Silas saw them. 6 riders emerging from the tree line to the east, spread in a loose skirmish line. They came slow this time, walking their horses, scanning the ground for traps. Learning from the last attack. Coming prepared. And in the center, mounted on a gray gelding with silver tack that caught the early light, rode a man Silas had never met but recognized instantly. The bearing, the gray at the temples, the Confederate officer's coat. Dalton Garrett had come himself. Grace, Silas said quietly, they're here. She appeared at his shoulder, looked out, and her breath caught. That's him. That's Garrett. The riders pulled up 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. Smart. Careful. Garrett raised one hand and his men stopped. Then he urged his horse forward alone, coming to 50 yards before halting. Silas Bridger. His voice carried clear across the misty ground. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Silas didn't answer, just watched, waited. The woman is a witness to crimes that frankly are none of your concern. Send her out and this ends peaceful. You can go back to your quiet life and forget any of this happened. Still Silas said nothing. Garrett's horse stamped impatiently. I know who you are. Bridger, best tracker in 7 states. You worked for me once 3 years back. You remember that gold shipment? I remember you. Hell, I picked you special for that job. A cold weight settled in Silas's gut. So it was true, all of it. You were too good. Bridger way too good. When I decided to go independent, I couldn't have you tracking me, so I took out insurance. Nothing personal, just business. Grace's hand found Silas's shoulder. Don't let him bait you. I'm not, Silas said, but his finger had moved to the trigger guard. Your wife and boy, Garrett continued, they died quick if it helps. We made it look like raiders, made it look like the flood got them. You never suspected a thing. Worked perfect until this nun had to go and see something she shouldn't have seen. Silas's jaw clenched, but his hand stayed steady. So here's my final offer. Send her out or I burn you out. Your choice, but either way, that woman dies today. Silas raised his rifle in one smooth motion and fired. The round passed within inches of Garrett's head. The man's horse reared, nearly throwing him. The other riders scattered, reaching for weapons. Garrett fought his mount under control, his face twisted with rage. Wrong answer, Bridger. Wrong goddamn answer. He wheeled his horse and galloped back to his men. They conferred briefly, weapons drawn, pointing at different approaches to the cabin. Planning. coordinating. Then they split. Two riders went left toward the burned barn. Two went right toward the corral. Garrett and one other man, a lean tracker type, who had to be Virgil Webb, dismounted and began advancing on foot using the terrain for cover. "Here they come," Silas said. The battle began. Silas tracked the riders going left, leading them just enough for the distance. He fired. The Henry kicked. One rider jerked and slumped, but stayed in the saddle, his horse continuing its run. Grace aimed at the riders going right. Her first shot missed clean. Her second found a horse's shoulder. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider into the mud. Gunfire erupted from a dozen directions. Bullets smashed through the remaining shutters. Chewed splinters from the door frame punched through, chinking between logs. The cabin filled with gun smoke and the sharp smell of burned powder. Silas worked the lever action, smooth and fast, firing, ejecting, chambering, firing again. The Henry held 15 rounds, and he counted each one in his head. At 10 rounds, he called out to Grace, "Reloading in 5, cover me." "Ready." He fired his last 5 shots in rapid succession, dropped behind cover, and began feeding fresh cartridges into the loading gate. 15 seconds. That was all it took. 15 seconds of vulnerability. 15 seconds when Grace held their defense alone. She fired methodically, picking her targets, making each round count. A man rose from behind the water trough to advance. She fired. He dropped. Another appeared at the corner of the burned barn. She fired. He ducked back. Clear. Silas was back up, rifle ready. The two men advancing on foot had covered half the distance, now moving from rock to scrub to shallow dip in the ground, using terrain like the professionals they were. Garrett and Webb, the leaders, the most dangerous. Silas aimed at a point where Garrett would have to cross open ground. Waited. There. The man broke cover, running low and fast. Silas let him, squeezed the trigger. The round caught Garrett in the left shoulder, spinning him. But he kept moving, rolled into cover behind a boulder alive. Grace fired at Webb, but he'd already gone to ground, invisible in the brush. The wounded rider from earlier had reached the barn ruins and dismounted. Now he opened fire with a rifle, his shots coming fast, but wild, the wound in his side throwing off his aim. But wild or not, bullets were bullets. One punched through the wall 6 inches from Grace's head. "Barn!" she shouted. "I see him." Silas shifted position, lined up the shot through a gap in the timbers, waited for the man to rise again. There, one shot. The man's head snapped back and he collapsed into the ashes. 3 down, 3 still fighting. The rider who'd been thrown from his horse had recovered and was advancing on foot, pistol drawn. He came from Grace's side, using the corral fence for cover. She tracked him, but he moved smart, never exposing himself for more than a heartbeat. Then he made his mistake. Tried to vault the fence in one smooth motion. Grace fired the instant his body cleared the top rail. The round took him in the chest, and he fell hard on the far side, not moving. 4 down. But the price of that shot was position. The rider had drawn her attention. While she focused on him, Virgil Webb had closed to 30 yards. He rose from cover and fired 3 rapid shots. One shattered the window frame beside Grace's head. The second buried itself in the log wall. The third hit her. Grace cried out and spun away from the window, her left arm clutched to her chest. "Grace," Silas started toward her, but she waved him back. "I'm all right, stay on your window." Blood seeped between her fingers, but she could still move the arm. Through and through, probably. Painful as hell, but not fatal. She grabbed a cloth and pressed it to the wound, using her teeth and her good hand to tie it in place. Silas fought down the rage that threatened to overwhelm his discipline. Later. He'd deal with that later. Right now, he had a job to finish. Garrett appeared suddenly at the door, having circled during the confusion of Grace's injury. He slammed his full weight against it. The cross braces held. He hit it again. Wood cracked but didn't give. One more hit and something would break. Silas aimed at the door, waiting. Garrett hit it a 3rd time and the top hinge gave way. The door sagged. Through the gap, Silas could see Garrett's face contorted with effort and rage. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed between them. The man who gave the order. The man whose family died because of it. 3 years of questions answered in that single moment of contact. Silas fired through the gap. Garrett threw himself sideways. The round passed through empty air, but it bought time. Time for Silas to cross the cabin. Time to brace the door from inside with his own body. Other window, he shouted to Grace. Webb's still out there. Grace moved to the opposite side, her wounded arm dangling, but her right hand steady on the pistol. She scanned the approach, looking for movement in the morning mist that still clung to the low spots. There, a shadow moving. She fired, missed. The shadow disappeared. Garrett hit the door again from outside. Silas felt the impact through the timbers, felt wood splintering. The door wouldn't hold much longer. He made a decision, dropped back from the door, raised the rifle, and fired 3 rounds through the wood at chest height where Garrett should be standing. Heard a curse from outside. Hit him. Maybe. Maybe not. But the impact stopped. Footsteps ran away from the door. Garrett retreating to cover. Reassessing. Regrouping. Silence fell over the cabin. Gunsmoke hung thick in the air. Both Silas and Grace breathed hard, ears ringing from the enclosed space filled with gunfire. Status, Silas said. Arms bleeding, but I can shoot. You. Good. 4 of them down for sure. Garrett and Webb still in play. Maybe one more. I thought I saw someone at the tree line. 3 against 2 then. Better odds. They'll come again. Yes, but they're running out of men and we're running out of nothing. Grace laughed, a short, sharp sound edged with pain and adrenaline. You always this confident? Fake it until you make it. They waited. Minutes stretched. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, revealing the battlefield in harsh morning light. Bodies lay scattered across the yard. Wounded horses had wandered off or stood with heads lowered, waiting for something to change. Then Virgil Webb stepped into view, walking slowly toward the cabin with his hands visible, but not raised. His left leg dragged. Blood darkened his pants from thigh to boot. Bridger, he called. I need to talk. Silas appeared at the window, rifle aimed. Talk. Garrett's hit bad, shoulder and ribs. He can't ride, can't fight, it's done. Then leave. He won't go without finishing this. Won't go without the nun. He doesn't get that choice. Webb stopped 20 yards out, close enough to be heard clearly, close enough to be killed if he made a wrong move. You were cavalry. You know how this goes. No surrender, no retreat. He'll die out here before he quits. Then he dies. But you don't have to. Webb's voice rose desperate. Just give us the woman, that's all. 1 life for 2, math's simple. Grace stepped up beside Silas. Her face had gone pale from blood loss, but her eyes blazed. I'll make this simple for you. Webb, you're not taking me, not alive, not dead, so you can tell Garrett to go straight to hell. Webb stared at her. Then he laughed, a bitter sound. You got more balls than half the men I know, sister. Shame you picked the wrong side. He turned and limped back toward the tree line where Garrett must be sheltering. Silas lowered the rifle. That was stupid. What? Showing yourself. He could have shot you. So could you have shot him? But you didn't, because you're not a murderer. I've killed men. In combat, in defense. That's different from execution. Silas looked at her. You're bleeding. Sit down. I'm fine. You're not. Sit. Grace sat more from lightheadedness than obedience. Silas examined her arm. The bullet had passed through the outer edge of her bicep, missing bone and major vessels. Clean wound. Painful but not crippling. He cleaned it with whiskey, applied golden seal paste, and bound it tight with fresh cloth. You did good out there, he said while he worked. I killed people. And you defended yourself. There's a difference. Is there? I took vows. I promised to serve life, not take it. Silas finished the bandage and met her eyes. You serve life by protecting the innocent, by standing against evil. Your God would understand that. And if he doesn't, he's not much of a God. Grace smiled through her pain. That's almost exactly what I've been telling myself. Then you're smarter than most. They heard horses, then hooves on soft ground. Both moved to the windows. 2 riders emerged from the trees. One horse carried Virgil Webb, slumped and barely holding on. The other carried Dalton Garrett, his left arm hanging useless, his coat soaked with blood. They turned north and rode slowly out of the valley, beaten men leaving a failed battlefield. Silas watched them go. It's not finished. What do you mean? Garrett's wounded but not dead. Webb's wounded but not dead. They'll regroup, come back with more men. So what do? We finish it properly. We take this to the law. They spent the rest of that day treating wounds and clearing bodies. 4 men lay dead on Silas's property now. 4 men who'd come with violence and met violence in return. Silas dragged them to a spot beyond the north fence and covered them with stones. Not proper burial, but enough to keep scavengers away until the law could deal with them. Grace rested through the afternoon, her arm throbbing but stable. By evening, she felt strong enough to help prepare for travel. "Where's the nearest territorial court?" she asked. "Silver Creek. 3 days' ride if we push. Can we make it both of us wounded?" Silas looked at her pale face, at the way she favored her injured arm, at the determination that showed through exhaustion. "We have to. Garrett will head there too. He's smart enough to know he needs to control the story. Get there first and paint himself as the victim, and we become the criminals. Then we leave tomorrow. Tonight. Now, every hour matters." They gathered supplies, food for 3 days, water, ammunition. Silas retrieved the horses from the ravine. The black stallion for him, the chestnut mare for Grace, the gray to carry their gear. As they prepared to mount up, Grace looked back at the cabin, at the bullet-scarred walls, at the safe enough sign on the gate, at the place that had sheltered her when she had nothing. "Will we come back?" she asked. "We'll come back. This is home now." They rode out under stars, following the north trail that would eventually meet the main road to Silver Creek. The horses were nervous, sensing their rider's tension, but they moved steady. Silas set an easy pace that would eat miles without exhausting the animals. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses and refill water from streams. Grace's arm pained her, but she didn't complain. Silas's ribs ached where he'd been thrown against the door, but he pushed through it. On the evening of the second day, they reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, a rough mining settlement that had grown into something approaching a real town. Maybe 300 permanent residents, stores, saloons, a church, a territorial marshal's office. They rode straight to the marshal's office, a squat log building with bars on the windows. Silas helped Grace down from her horse. She swayed but caught herself. Inside, a man in his 50s looked up from paperwork. Silver badge on his vest, shrewd eyes that had seen trouble before. Marshal Thomas Brennan. "Help you. I'm Silas Bridger. This is Sister Grace Hartwell. We need to report murders and attempted murder." Brennan set down his pen. "Go on." They told the story, all of it. The massacre of the mission group, the murder of Federal Marshal David Hayes, Father Benedict's betrayal, Dalton Garrett's gang, the attacks on Silas's ranch, the evidence they could provide. Brennan listened without interruption. When they finished, he sat quiet for a long moment. "Dalton Garrett," he said finally, "former captain, decorated officer, respected man in some circles. You're accusing him of a lot." "We're accusing him of what he did," Grace said. "I watched him murder a federal marshal. I'll swear to it under oath." "And you've got proof." Silas produced the locket. "This belonged to my wife. I found it on one of Garrett's men. Connect that to the gold robbery 3 years ago, the one Garrett supposedly deserted over, and you've got a pattern." Brennan examined the locket. "This proves the man who had it knew your wife. Doesn't prove Garrett ordered anything." "Then you've got Sister Grace's testimony. Eyewitness to Marshal Hayes's murder. That's a hanging offense. If she's credible, if Garrett doesn't have his own story." "What are you saying?" Grace asked. Brennan looked at her directly. "I'm saying Garrett rode into town yesterday, came straight to me, said he'd been attacked by squatters on his mining claim, said they killed 4 of his men, said one of the squatters was a nun who'd gone mad after her mission was hit by bandits, said she was claiming all kinds of wild things." Silas felt his stomach drop. He got here first. He got here first, and he's got wounds that back up his story about being attacked. "Those wounds came from defending myself," Silas said. "From defending Grace." "I believe you, but belief isn't evidence, and right now it's your word against his." Grace stepped forward. "Then put us both in front of a judge. Let us testify. Let a jury decide who's telling the truth." Brennan considered this. "Judge Blackwell's circuit includes Silver Creek. He'll be here in 4 days for the monthly session. I can hold you both as witnesses. Keep you safe until then. And Garrett, I'll bring him in too, on suspicion. Can't arrest him without more evidence, but I can hold him for questioning." "He'll run," Silas said. "He won't. Running makes him look guilty. He's smarter than that. He'll stay. He'll fight this legal. They spent the next 4 days in the marshal's care. Not prisoners exactly, but not free either. Brennan kept them in a back room of his office, guarded but comfortable. Fed them, tended their wounds, made sure neither Garrett nor his remaining men could reach them. Silas used the time to heal, to rest, to prepare his testimony. Grace did the same, writing out everything she'd witnessed, creating a detailed account that could serve as evidence. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison Blackwell arrived. 62 years old, former Union colonel, a man known for fairness but also for having no patience for nonsense. The trial, such as it was, took place in the territorial courthouse, a timber building with a raised bench and rows of seats for spectators. Word had spread about the case. The room filled with miners and merchants and working folks curious to see justice done. Garrett sat at one table with a lawyer from Denver. He'd cleaned up, fresh clothes, arm in a proper sling, face shaved, looking every inch the respected businessman wrongly accused. Silas and Grace sat at the other table. No lawyer, just themselves and the truth. Judge Blackwell called the court to order. This is a preliminary hearing to determine if charges should be brought against Mr. Dalton Garrett for the murder of Federal Marshal David Hayes and conspiracy to commit murder. The territory will present its case. Marshal Brennan stood and called Grace as his first witness. She took the stand, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. For the next hour, she told her story. Slowly, carefully, every detail she could remember. The attack on the mission, Father Benedict's betrayal, the cold-blooded execution of Marshal Hayes, Garrett taking the badge, the murder of her sister nuns, her flight, the snakebite, finding refuge at Silas's ranch. Garrett's lawyer cross-examined her, tried to paint her as traumatized and unreliable, suggested grief and fear had colored her memories, implied she'd invented the whole thing to explain why she'd survived when others died. Grace never wavered, never contradicted herself, answered every question with the same steady certainty. When she stepped down, Brennan called Silas. He testified about finding Grace, about the attacks on his property, about the locket found on Garrett's dead man, about the 3-year-old mystery of his family's death. Garrett's lawyer objected. The witness is speculating. He has no proof his family was killed by my client. Sustained, Judge Blackwell said. Stick to what you know for certain, Mr. Bridger. Silas accepted the rebuke. He testified only to facts, the attacks, the bodies, the evidence he could prove. Then Marshal Brennan presented the locket, presented testimony from town residents who remembered Sarah and Ethan Bridger, established that the locket was genuine, connected it to one of Garrett's men. Finally, Brennan called his surprise witness, a miner named Jacob Stone, who'd worked one of Garrett's claims the previous year. Tell the court what you told me, Brennan said. Stone cleared his throat. I was working Shaft 3 up in the high country. Garrett owned it but didn't visit much. One day, 3 summers back, maybe late July, he rode up with some men. They had a woman and a boy with them, prisoners. The woman was screaming. The boy was crying. They took them into a shed. I heard shots. When Garrett and his men came out, they were alone. They burned the shed. Garrett saw me watching. Told me if I ever spoke about what I'd seen, I'd end up the same way. I believed him. Kept quiet. Until now. The courtroom erupted. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel for silence. Garrett's lawyer scrambled. This man is clearly lying for some reward. I'm not getting nothing, Stone said. Just figured it was time to tell the truth. Man can only carry so much shame. Judge Blackwell studied Stone for a long moment. Then he turned to Garrett. Mr. Garrett, you have anything to say? Garrett stood. His face had gone pale, but he kept his voice steady. This is all fabrication. Lies told by people with grudges. I'm an innocent man. You're a lot of things, the judge said, but innocent isn't one of them. Based on the testimony presented, I'm ordering you bound over for trial on charges of murdering Federal Marshal David Hayes. Additional charges of conspiracy to murder and multiple counts of murder may be added as investigation continues. Bail is denied. You'll be held in territorial custody until trial. Garrett's composure finally cracked. You can't do this. I have rights. I have connections. You have the right to a fair trial, that's all. Marshal, take him into custody. Brennan and 2 deputies moved forward. Garrett looked around wildly, maybe thinking about running, but there was nowhere to go. They clapped iron shackles on his wrists and led him away. As he passed Grace, he stopped, looked at her with pure hatred. You should have died with the others. But I didn't, Grace said quietly, and now everyone will know what you are. Garrett was hauled away. The courtroom slowly emptied. Judge Blackwell called Silas and Grace forward. You two have been through hell, he said, but you did right bringing this to law. Too many men think justice comes from a gun. Sometimes it does, but whenever possible, it should come from a courtroom. What happens now? Grace asked. Trial in about 6 weeks. You'll both need to testify again. After that, assuming he's convicted, he hangs. Probably within the month. Federal marshal's murder doesn't leave much room for mercy. They left the courthouse into bright afternoon sunlight. Felt strange after days inside. Felt strange to walk free streets knowing Garrett was behind bars. Marshal Brennan caught up with them outside. You'll be safe now. Garrett's men have scattered. Webb disappeared. Without their leader, they're nothing. Thank you, Silas said, for believing us. I believe in evidence. You had it. Brennan paused. One more thing. The minor stone. He mentioned a shed up at Shaft 3. If your wife and son are buried up there, you might want to give them proper rest. Silas knotted his throat too tight for words. They collected their horses and rode out of Silver Creek that evening. Neither spoke for the first hour. Too much had happened. Too much to process. Finally, Grace broke the silence. We won. We survived. That's not the same as winning. Close enough. They rode another hour before stopping to make camp. While Silas tended the horses, Grace gathered wood for a fire. Her arm still pained her, but it was healing clean. Like her snake bite had healed. Like everything eventually healed given time. Over a simple meal of beans and coffee, Grace asked the question that had been building. What will you do after the trial? Go back to the ranch, rebuild the barn, fix what's broken, same as always. Lone, Silas met her eyes across the fire. Depends. On what? On whether you're planning to stay. Grace smiled. I'm planning to stay, if you'll have me. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. They sat in companionable silence until Grace asked another question. My vows. The church. I need to settle that before I can think about anything else. What do you mean? I wrote to the Archbishop in Denver, explained everything, asked for guidance, asked if I was still bound by vows I took before my world changed. What did he say? Haven't heard back yet, but I know what he'll say. The church understands dispensation. Understands that sometimes circumstances release us from promises made in different times. And if he says no, if he says you're still a nun, Grace looked at the stars beginning to appear overhead. Then I'll have a choice to make between the church and other possibilities. What do you think you'll choose? I think I already have. I just need permission to admit it. They rode back to the ranch over the next 3 days, took their time, let the horses rest, let themselves rest. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the valley below, saw the cabin and the burned barn and the safe enough sign on the gate, something settled in both of them. Home. This was home now. They spent the next weeks rebuilding. Silas framed a new barn, simpler than before but solid. Grace helped him raise the walls, hammer nails, fit boards. They worked from dawn until dark, their bodies healing, their partnership deepening. A letter arrived 6 weeks after they'd returned. Grace opened it with shaking hands, read it twice, then looked at Silas with tears in her eyes. I'm released. The Archbishop said, given the violence I witnessed and the trauma I endured, my vows are annulled. I'm free. Silas crossed the room and took her hands in his. What do you want to do with that freedom? I want to stay here. I want to build this life with you. If you'll have me, I'll have you. Question is, will you have me? I'm not easy. I'm damaged. I've got ghosts. So do I. Maybe that's why we fit. That evening, as the sun set behind the western mesa, Silas retrieved something from the trunk beside his bed. A small silver ring. Simple. Worn smooth from years of being carried. My mother's, he said. She wore it for 40 years. Gave it to Sarah when we married. I kept it after everything. Figured it should go to someone who stays. Someone who builds things that last. He held it out to Grace. Will you stay? Will you marry me? Grace took the ring. Slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Yes, she said. I'll stay. They married a week later. No church, no priest, just the two of them at sunrise on the spot where Grace had first crawled, bleeding into Silas's life. They spoke simple vows. Silas, I promise to defend you, honor you, build with you. Grace, I promise to stand with you, trust you, grow old with you. They sealed it with a kiss, not passionate, just honest. A promise made solid. Life settled into rhythms, work and rest, seasons passing, the new barn completed, fences mended, garden planted. Gradually the bullet scars in the cabin walls faded. Gradually the memories of violence loosened their grip. 1 year after Grace's arrival, she stood in the doorway of the cabin looking out at a valley transformed by their labor. The ranch prospered, the horses were healthy, the garden produced. Everything had found its place. She felt Silas come up behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "Just thinking about how much has changed, how much we've built." His hands moved lower, resting on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant now. The baby moved under his palms. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Him, mother's intuition. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, after my son, and after the life we're giving this child. One his brother never got to have." Grace covered his hands with hers. "Ethan Bridger. I like it." They stood together, watching the sun paint the valley gold and orange. A hawk circled overhead. The wind carried the scent of rain. Everything was as it should be. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Taking me in. All the trouble I brought." Silas turned her to face him. "Every single day I wake up grateful you crawled across my land. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What? A reason to keep living instead of just surviving." Grace smiled. "We saved each other then." "No. We gave each other permission to save ourselves." Inside the cabin, the stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the horses moved in their corral. The safe enough sign creaked gently in the breeze. This was home. This was peace. This was the life they'd built from ashes and blood and stubborn refusal to surrender. And it was enough.